Could Benjamin Netanyahu be about to lose an election? He's been around for so long that it's hard to imagine him not being in the mix. But there's a vote coming up soon, and he could lose to a man who's little known outside of Israel by the name of Gadi Eisenkot.
Eisenkot's a former top Israeli general. He served in Netanyahu's war cabinet, and his son was killed in the war in Gaza. In the Western press, he's sometimes being referred to as the anti-Netanyahu. But is he really?
Today on the show, we speak to the editor of the New Yorker magazine, David Remnick, who's been with Eisenkot, and he's just written a long profile of him. From the BBC, I'm Tristan Redman.
And I'm Asma Khalid. And welcome to The Global Story on YouTube. David, thank you for taking the time to join us on The Global Story. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you with us, David. You've written this long profile for the New Yorker of Gadi Eisenkot. We're talking to you today to try to understand who this man is, because he's one of the front runners for the upcoming Israeli election, which is a big deal. When Asma and I both read your piece, which we really enjoyed, we were really struck by one story in it in particular, which is the story of how Gadi Eisenkot lost his son not so long ago. What happened, and why has this story become so central to his election run?
One of his 5 children was called up as a reservist. He was an army medic, and he was sent on a mission with his small group to retrieve the bodies of 2 hostages who had been killed in Gaza. The bodies of them, not 2 living hostages, but the bodies. And during that mission, it is likely he either was shot or more likely stepped on an IED, an explosive device. And everybody heard about this because of who Gadi Eisenkot is. And the funeral was on television. His Eisenkot's eulogy was televised. People felt this very acutely.
So it sounds like this story of losing his son is really central to how the Israeli public views Eisenkot.
I think that's absolutely true.
But Eisenkot has a long backstory in Israeli public life, and you write about that as well. Can you tell us what that story is?
So Eisenkot is Moroccan. Every prime minister since Ben Gurion has been Ashkenazi. In other words, a descendant of Eastern European Jews. When he goes to a town that has a lot of Moroccan Jews, people who came from Morocco or from other Muslim states, Iraq, Syria, these are Jews who left in the 40s and the 50s and into the 60s. They see him as possibly one of his. They use a Moroccan Arabic phrase indicating one of us. And that's not something that Netanyahu can challenge. But Gadi Eisenkot is a military man. He's a very high-ranking military officer, was even at one point chief of staff under Netanyahu.
Yeah, he worked his way up to the very top of the IDF and became this kind of almost celebrity status that you have when you become the head of the Israeli military. But what did he...
If I can point out, though, I will say this. Yes, maybe celebrity status gives him a certain glamour that he does not have. He is not a magnetic personality. You know, Bibi Netanyahu, think of him what you will, and I certainly think of him as I do. I am no fan and have been covering him since the 90s. He is extremely fluid. He's a great political campaigner, a very cynical one. His English is famously perfect, having spent so many years in the United States as a young man. Eisenkot's English, it's like my Russian, it's a bit rough. And he's not a magnetic speaker. He's a kind of, if you don't mind a little Yiddish, a little kind of a schlumpy, menschy, your favorite uncle type person, unthreatening. At the same time, as a military man, it should be pointed out, he was the key originator of what's called the Dahia Doctrine, which has to do with the kind of asymmetrical warfare, if you will. In other words, if there are attacks coming from Hezbollah, from the Dahia neighborhood of Beirut, that it is doctrine to attack with great ferocity even civilian infrastructure from where those attacks are emanating.
He's not a bleeding heart.
No,
He's a military tough guy. Is that a fair description?
this is a man of his institution.
Okay, well, by the time October the 7th happens, David, Eisenkot is in the Knesset. He's left the military, so he's an MP in Parliament. He's a relatively new politician. He's only been there for a year. He's not a supporter of Netanyahu, but when the attack happens, Netanyahu nonetheless asks him to join a war cabinet.
Correct.
Why does he agree to that, and what is his role in that cabinet?
In the light of what's happened in Gaza, and the scale of the horror there, it should be recalled the atmosphere in Israel right after October 7th. This was, I can't begin to describe the sense of shock in Israeli society and grief and disorientation. In other words, the entire purpose of the state, in some sense, which is the security of people that for centuries had been defenseless, essentially, to anti-Semitism, violent anti-Semitism, culminating with the Holocaust. And suddenly, one day, hundreds and hundreds of Israelis are killed, over 200 are taken hostage and brought back to Gaza. The state collapsed. This was a very disunified moment in Israeli history. It had been preceded by endless demonstrations about what was called judicial reform, which was really kind of a Netanyahu government attempt to disempower the Supreme Court and the Attorney General. This was a huge issue in internal Israel. So he needed this show of unity in the most important decisions being made, namely the military decisions. And so he brought in Eisenkot. He is, by the standards of present day, post-October 7th Israeli politics, and it's important to point that out, somebody of the center left.
Can you define that in American political terms? Maybe it's not translatable, but
It is translatable, but we're speaking in different tongues. In other words, the issue that Americans and Brits and almost everybody else thinks about first and foremost when they're thinking about Israeli politics is the Palestinian question. Like it or not, that is not the central issue in the Israeli election campaign. In fact, I would say none of the major contenders, except for Yair Golan of the Democrats, dares to speak about a resolution, a solution to the terrible conflict that's been going on for now so many decades. And so I thought Eisenkot and another general, Benny Gantz, were asked to join this essentially national unity war cabinet of very experienced generals, and they fell into argument pretty quickly.
over what exactly?
Well, the first thing that happened is Eisenkot helped stave off an immediate attack against Lebanon, against Hezbollah. There were generals that wanted immediately to open a second front in the north. Eisenkot successfully argued against this and helped stave that off. More consequentially, where Eisenkot is concerned, Eisenkot thought the strategy should be first and foremost, get all the hostages home. First and foremost. People in the cabinet, not just Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, but also eventually, more consequentially, the prime minister himself, Netanyahu himself, really wanted vengeance in a completist way, to defeat Hamas as if this could be done in some totalist way. And if that meant some hostages would have to remain behind, or those deals would not happen as quickly as possible, then so be it. And after a while, Eisenkot could not countenance that, and he and Gantz left the war cabinet.
And then shortly after, he left the war cabinet, and that was, I believe, in the summer of 2024. So a little while later, he decides to form his own political party. And
Yeah.
David, if we can just explain that Israel has a coalition system of governance, it's not anything like our two-party system here in the United States.
If you're not up to date on Israeli politics, you think of Labor as this big party and Likud as this big party. Labor is now tiny. So you have to form coalition with other parties, which makes things very, shall we say, interesting and chaotic. And so new parties are being formed with rather stunning regularity. And sometimes they form around one person and sometimes around a political impulse of a particular moment. Somebody's going to have to form a coalition to form a government come this election. It's completely unlikely that any one party is going to get 61 votes. The coalition that Eisenkot would be likely to lead is his party, which is called Yashar, which means straightforward or honest or something like that. And then you have a party led by Naftali Bennett, who's a man of the right and was briefly prime minister. He's together with Yesh Atid, which is a party of the kind of center left. And then you have the Democrats, it's more of the left. Am I confusing everybody? Have I succeeded in confusing absolutely everybody at this point?
No, you're doing great. Carry on.
And on the right, you have Likud, but then you have these other parties, and most vividly, you have these religious parties, religious nationalist, and then religious. And what Netanyahu does to keep feeding that coalition is to make all kinds of concessions to the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, so that they don't have to go into the draft. We have a big community of ultra-Orthodox Israelis, who, by the way, were not Zionists long ago, who, A, refused to serve in the military or tried to, and B, are the recipients of enormous amounts of essentially social welfare programs. This infuriates most Israelis. My kid's going to go into the army and get killed to protect you, and you're going to read Torah and Talmud and call it a day? This is a very, very divisive thing. But cynically, the extremely secular Bibi Netanyahu is willing to make these deals all the time for the sake of building coalitions.
And what is Eisenkot's platform in this party that he founds? What's he offering Israeli voters?
Well, he thinks there should be an end, that everybody should serve in one way or another, even the Arab community. In other words, if you want to do some sort of social service, the equivalent of a domestic AmeriCorps or Peace Corps or something like that, okay. In other words, he has answers for that. An end to this so-called judicial reform, a greater emphasis on democracy, call it separation of powers. He sees and recognizes that the Netanyahu of now, unlike the Likud of many years ago, is not a particularly democratically inclined party, to say the least, and he is pro-democracy. Now, I would argue you don't have a democracy unless all your citizens have equal rights, and that brings in the Palestinian question. I don't believe that my country was a true democracy until arguably the mid-'60s, until black voters were empowered the way they were by the Civil Rights Act. So again, a resolution to the Palestinian question is not in the center of the debate, to put it mildly.
That is so striking to hear you say, David, because that does feel like the central question so many Americans think about when they think about Israel. And I have seen a number of profiles of Eisenkot. He is being framed, by and large, I would say, in the Western press, as sort of the anti-Netanyahu. But you're describing a man who, it sounds like, at least on some substantive foreign policy issues, isn't necessarily all that different.
Insofar as Eisenkot is the anti-Bibi, what does that mean? It means it's a question of character, his behavior. He's not considered corrupt. Bibi in many circles is considered corrupt. He doesn't he's not giving the world away to the religious. Bibi gives the world away to the ultra orthodox. He will fight back against settler violence. Bibi does not dare to do that, and when he talks about it in preposterous euphemisms. He will stop. He will fight for internal democracy insofar as Bibi was trying to disempower the Supreme Court and the Attorney General. Those are big internal issues. And on the Palestinian question, I don't think you're going to ever hear him in this campaign talk about anything vividly specific like a two-state solution or anything of the like, but you will hear language about moving forward, progress, try to end violence, et cetera, et cetera. The most modest, one could call mealy-mouthed rhetoric, to mainly not to inflame anybody, mainly to not have it be at the center of the conversation. Netanyahu wants it to be at the very center of the conversation, insofar as he wants to make sure everybody knows he would never compromise with the Palestinians at all, ever.
So, David, it sounds like there is some daylight between Eisenkot and Netanyahu, perhaps not a chasm of political daylight between the two of them. But let me present you, I hope you'll indulge us if I present you with a counterfactual to help us understand where he stands on things. If Eisenkot had been prime minister in the aftermath of October the 7th, what's your sense of what might have gone differently? Like, what would have been different and what would have been the same?
I don't know that today we'd be sitting here with the landscape of Gaza being an absolute ruin, with at the very minimum 70,000 people, including 20,000 children, dead. Would there have been a war? Yes. How would it have been prosecuted? Some of your listeners will quickly say, yes, but this is the architect of the Dahia Doctrine. But I don't know what that would imply, and I would be a fool to predict it in any specificity. But I don't want to be naive. It's not as if October 7th would have been answered with a laurel branch.
We saw the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejecting a plan from Donald Trump's Board of Peace for the disarmament of Hamas. What would Eisenkot have done had he been in office, in your best estimation?
I don't know.
Okay.
Look, what's happening here? Bibi, who is in trouble in this country, but he's not running for president of the United States. His image in the United States, and I assume in the UK, could not be more miserable. He's a talking point in a lot of American political campaigns, not just in the state of Michigan, but all over the place. He's running to remain as Prime Minister of Israel, which has gotten increasingly right wing. He needs to keep his base, which is the religious nationalists, the ultra-Orthodox, the traditional Likud, and that kind of soft right that I've talked about that's kind of up for grabs. And so in his view, he needs to say, no Palestinian state, end to security threat. Look what I've done by dealing with threats all over, although that argument has gotten much shakier, right? A year ago, he might have argued, you could argue with him, but okay, we've bombed I've gotten the United States to bomb the nuclear reactor in nuclear facilities in Iran. We had this incredible James Bond-like success with Hezbollah. Sinwar is no longer alive to lead Hamas in Gaza. Nasrallah is no longer alive in Beirut, and might have called it a day there. But now we've had this war that was supposed to take 3 weeks or whatever it was going to be. Now 6 months later, the Iran leadership was, quote, I hate this phrase, taken out, but then replaced by an even more hardline Iranian leadership. And it's in control of Hormuz and much else. And the Israelis see this failure. And so Netanyahu has to create the imagery of strength, or rebuild this imagery of strength and security in the face of the facts. He's in trouble, but I would emphasize to your listeners this. He is behind in the polls. The opposition coalition is at about at 60. He's at about at 50, which is quite far from winning. But he is a incredibly crafty campaigner, and it's 80 days until the election, and that's a lifetime in Israeli politics.
David, our show is about where the world and America meet. And I've heard you talk about both Netanyahu and Eisenkot in the context of a domestic Israeli political dynamic. But it is, in my view, important to note that, Israel's longstanding closest ally has been the United States, and that this election in Israel is happening at a moment when US politics on Israel have shifted dramatically, as you know. I mean, we see this if we look at, a Pew Research poll from this spring that shows 60% of US adults now have an unfavorable view of Israel. These numbers are numbers we have not historically seen. We saw also recently an unprecedented number of Democrats in Congress vote to block billions of dollars in military aid. And this leads, I guess, to my fundamental question here, which is, do you have a sense that Eisenkot has a plan for salvaging the US-Israel relationship? Because it strikes me that in the United States, being not Netanyahu is not necessarily enough anymore in our political climate.
No, but I think he's right to think it will be a lot.
Okay, tell us more.
The dynamics of how Americans feel about Israel, about spending money on Israeli defense and doing it reflexively, I think that is Netanyahu's most catastrophic loss that is recognized in Israel, that they're not going to have automatic American support anymore. It's no longer considered somehow taboo to speak up against Israeli behavior or AIPAC or when people routinely talk about war crimes, genocide, all kinds of descriptions of what was transpired in the last 3 years. And it is horrific, and it has transformed the U.S.-Israeli relationship not only in the Democratic Party, but you're seeing it as a divisive issue in the Republican Party. Has anti-Semitism grown in horrific ways in the U.S. and in Britain and elsewhere? Absolutely. But I think it is possible, and right-thinking people are able to recognize that there's a difference between criticism and even condemnation of Israeli political and military behavior, and not think that's automatically anti-Semitism.
The reason I guess I want to understand what Eisenkot's thinking on this is that I did, some reporting a few years ago, pre-October 7th, on the shifting dynamics in the relationship. And amongst many Democrats at the time, I heard about Netanyahu. Netanyahu was, in their view, the catalyst, the reason for this deteriorating relationship. Now, when I talk to folks, particularly on the left, on the Democratic side, I hear a more fundamental shift of the relationship. As we said, people saying that they want to wholeheartedly block military aid or not have that military aid in question. It feels like there is a beginning of a reimagining of the entire relationship. And how does Eisenkot, does he know how he's dealing, or does he have a plan for how to deal with that?
I think he has to win in order to confront that.
Okay.
They're not naive. And I think only when they're lying to themselves do they ascribe every tendency about that shift to anti-Semitism. Look, I've written about 2 foreign places my whole career. I'm now an elderly gentleman of 67, and when I would write about Russia, where I lived for 4 years, the reaction to pieces in the New Yorker or the Washington Post, where I used to work, it was generally, "That is so interesting," or "I didn't know X," or "Let me tell you about what I think." It was sometimes hostile, but no, when I write about this, you can't win. So I've been called too soft, or a self-hating Jew, every insult imaginable, that is part and parcel of the emotional, historical quality of this set. And I've never seen it as bad, as volatile, as filled with legitimate concern and fury, but also at the same time, racial hatred. And to think that everything will get better by magic, I think is naive. It's going to take affirmative imagination and political bravery all around, and that's not going to happen overnight.
David Remnick, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk this through with you.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
And that's it for The Global Story today. Thanks, as always, for spending some time with us. And if you want to find more from The Global Story, I should mention that we are also available as an audio podcast. You can find us on bbc.com or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.